Deputy Catherine Connolly.
And just I want to agree with the comments by Deputy Shanahan in relation to the procurement. That process was brought in ostensibly to make the situation fairer and to ensure fair competition. But certainly, from my limited experience, but it was 4 years on the public accounts, there are serious problems in the way that it's operating to the disadvantage of employers, not employers, but businesses in Galway and other areas. And it certainly needs to be looked at. And I understand it was being looked at. I forget now under which department, Minister, but it would be great if you could clarify that, because we were in receipt of ongoing representations, for example, from the Galway Roscommon Educational and Training Board, and they highlighted the problems on the ground in relation to the procurement. And secondly, in relation to Richard Boyd Barrett, Deputy Barrett, I'm absolutely in agreement with him when I look at this. First of all, I want to thank, as I always do, the Oireachtas Library and Research Service. I realise they're under pressure, and they produced an excellent document to give us an overview of this, what you're proposing, and of course the previous legislation in 12 and 16. And I think it's important to thank them, because they do a great job in educating us, and at least if we don't, it's our own fault. But certainly, before getting into the intricacies of it, I think Deputy Barrett has absolutely captured it. We're setting up a fund of €2 billion, which is good, to make credit available. But we're going to do that through 3 pillar banks, and we're going to make sure that their risk is tiny, really. And really, we should be looking at community banking, shouldn't we? We tried this before in the opposition, but the previous government said we can't do it, even though other countries have done it. New Zealand has done it, Germany has done it. And now we're looking at 3 pillar banks, which I'll go into the minutiae now, but it certainly seems incredible, and he's absolutely right. It's socialism for the banks and capitalism for the taxpayer, really. And I don't think I could put it any better than he's put it. In relation to this, again, to put it in context, we're being told that this will be the largest such scheme in the history of the state, this credit guarantee scheme, and will be operated as with the existing credit guarantee scheme by the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland. And then we're told that all loans and credit facilities will be made available through the 3 participating banks, AIB, Bank of Ireland and Ulster Bank. Now, Minister, I understood when I was listening carefully to your speech that this is open to other credit institutions as well. I'm not sure why that's not made, why we don't know that or who they are. When will we know that? And I'm sure you'll clarify that when you're speaking.
But it'll be open to all lending institutes to use this scheme.
That's good. That's good to know. So if we look at this now, we look at this in terms of €2 billion, and the liability for the state is to be capped at €1.6 billion. And I'm not going to go in, it's been said by many speakers before me, the details of it. But we don't know what interest rate. You're telling us it will be low, you expect it to be low, and you expect an interest reduction because the cap on the portfolio is gone. So you expect now there'll be, but you just expect, you anticipate. But we have no guarantee at all that the interest rate will go down. Now, I'm looking at a letter here from, as we've all got many, many letters from the bus and coach operators, and amongst many of their points and recommendations, they tell us that the existing scheme needs to be altered. The existing credit guarantee scheme needs to be altered, but the same points apply to this, to address the needs of small businesses, because the interest rates are simply too high. They're too high and they're not taking them. And we know that the uptake on the current scheme has been very, very low. And depending on which figures you read, and I'm looking at the COVID-19 Business Supports Tracker from the 3rd of July, and the existing scheme was set up in 2012, and by 2020, only 867 approvals had been made. I'm not sure if they actually materialised into actual loans, but 867 approvals, because different figures have been used tonight. But one thing that's clear is that there was a complete underutilisation of that scheme from 2012. The value of the total approvals made in 8 years was 152.56 million. And there was authorisation to go up to 150 million yearly, and yet in eight years we went up to 152 million, clearly underutilised. And then if we look at the review that was carried out, and the review was carried out back in 2013, unfortunately, I would have thought that it should have been reviewed more frequently. There was a second one carried out by Endicon in 2019, but the credit guarantee scheme was only a small part of that analysis. And those analyses told us is the existing one is too cumbersome, too restricted, the time span too little, and many other weaknesses. Now, it has taken a pandemic for us for the government to put legislation before us to change that existing scheme. I would have thought a scheme that was in since 2012 and under-functioning, given the importance of SMEs to the economy, should have been reviewed and changed. I know that legislation was brought in 2016 with some limited changes, but that didn't change really the uptake of it. It went up a little bit, but not. If you look at figures in isolation, you see that the sanctions went up, and that's welcome. But you have to put it in context of the number of enterprises that there are in Ireland. And you've already quoted from that the number. And I mean, they're staggering. Small to medium enterprises alone account for 99.8%, or 255,000 of active enterprises in Ireland, representing 70.1% of all employment and generate 41.5% of the gross value added in the Irish economy. So you know that, we all know that, and you've quoted it, but I think it's worth sort of focusing on those figures. I hadn't realised it until the last few weeks when I took a particular interest in the legislation that's coming before us, to realise the importance of small to medium enterprises and the micro enterprises to the country and to employment. But when we look at that, and then we see that the existing scheme is not being used, I have worries in relation to this scheme equally, that it will not be used, or that they won't draw down the loans being provided because of the interest rate, their experience to date, and as other speakers have said, it's also adding to their indebtedness. There's also a lack of clarity in relation to the criteria that will be used. There's also, it's a statutory instrument, I understand, that's going to bring in the fishermen, the farmers, and the other mid-caps, is that the name of it? So again, this lack of clarity on that, or when that's going to happen. In relation to the speed, and this has been commented on again by other TDs, the speed, again, I realise there's urgency to this. However, we're aware for months, and we certainly know from the report produced by the Central Bank back in April, that liquidity was going to be a big problem for businesses in Ireland. It's now July, and we're rushing through legislation through the Dáil. Again, like Deputy Barrett, and like with the legislation last week, which I spent a lot of time trying to get my head around, I have a difficulty. I will support it, but I'm supporting something that I'm not entirely happy with at all. I'm supporting something that there's been a piece of legislation where no regulatory impact analysis has been done because of the speed with which we're being asked to put the legislation through the Dáil. And I look again at what the library has told us, and they tell us that a short regulatory impact analysis was produced for this bill by the Department of Business and Enterprise and Innovation. And the key points are included in Table 4, so they tell us the costs and the competitiveness. And then they look at the benefits: north, south, east, west, relations, gender equality, benefits, none. Poverty proofing, industry costs, quality regulation, benefits, none. So I'll just read, north-south, east-west relations, gender equality, benefits none. Now, I'm not sure how to interpret that, but I look at Social Justice Ireland, and I've quoted it last week, and they tell us, prior to the pandemic, rural areas generally have an older population, higher rates of part-time employment, lower medium incomes, higher dependent ratios, higher poverty ratios than the national average. They go on to quote from a report which I've previously used from the regional assemblies that looked at the impact of COVID on a regional basis. And it's not unexpected, I think, they're finding that the regions and the rural areas, and they mention Donegal, they mention a number of other counties, Kerry, Galway, Clare, Cavan, all suffering much more than other places in Ireland because of COVID. And yet there is no impact analysis as part of this legislation, which is very, very difficult to accept and to vote for. The other point I want to make is there's been a lot of discussion about the new green way in Europe, and I welcome that. I'm looking forward to seeing the details of it. But none of this legislation so far has mentioned climate change or our obligations under climate change. We have said on the one hand that we can't go back to the way we were, that we have to learn from COVID and we go forward. On the other hand, we're actually making things worse, in my opinion. If we just take one little example in Galway, we decided on a pilot basis to run a cycle route out in Sawthill. It worked a treat. Under pressure, I understand, local authority have stopped that. And that's gone. They bent to pressure. And the traffic on the road is almost back to where it was. At the same time that the government has given out a daily message, don't use public transport. Now, I really think you should reflect on that message. I think you should make public transport ready to use during COVID. I myself have an example of someone that used public transport, and I'm now putting a car on the road, much to my shame. And I'm part of a message going out to say don't use public transport at a time where we've declared a climate emergency. You've got to reflect on this message, and you've got to reflect on what needs to go in to get public transport back in full use. And we have to tell us what you're doing for the bus and coach industry. And they've clearly written to you and written to the government on many occasions with very practical suggestions. So we can't, on the one hand, say we're serious about climate change and the biodiversity crisis that we have, while on the other, and say we're never going back to where we are, when we're actually doing that with every single measure that we're taking. Now, I stand here as someone, and I've said it repeatedly, I represent Galway West and South Mayo, which takes in the Aran Islands, Inishbofin, all of the rural areas in Connemara and South Mayo, Kilmaine, Shrule, Cong and Galway City. I stand here for sustainable development for my city and my county, not on a parochial level, but because we need to do it for every county. So we're getting a fund of 2 billion. We're guaranteeing it. We're letting the banks to set the interest rate. And we see nothing wrong with that. And I'm now part of this legislation that's given the thumbs up to the bank to set whatever interest rate they want when struggling businesses want to access funds that we're getting at a zero interest rate. It doesn't make sense to me, Minister. And what doesn't make sense at all to me is that we're not looking at the sustainability of businesses, certainly from a financial point of view and a business point of view, but also in terms of the environment, climate change, energy. We should be looking at all of that in relation to funds. Finally, we're not looking at grants at all. We're giving out loans to companies and small businesses that are already indebted and who have liquidity problems, according to the central bank back in April. Surely grants would make much more sense, seeing as we're accessing money at a very cheap rate. So I'm going to reflect on whether I'm supporting this legislation. I'm inclined to support it because the concept behind it is very good, and small businesses, micro, which we did already, and the fishermen and farmers certainly need our help. But they don't need help where they're going to be more indebted and in trouble. And we certainly need to look at sustainability on more than a financial level.